Hello, my name is Rachel Drobnak, and today I will be presenting my research on the commercialization of quinoa. This research paper will soon be submitted for publication, and the project was completed in collaboration with Dr. Krista Isaacs at Michigan State University. Nowadays, quinoa is a relatively common pantry item in the United States. Most people know that it's nutritious, and some may know it contains all 9 essential amino acids. Yet quinoa treks a messy path from seed to plate. Specifically, its producers lack support to sustain themselves and their land in a new global market. Quinoa is one of many underutilized species. These are historically marginalized, non-commodity crops, often grown by indigenous populations. These groups of crops are an important element of agricultural diversity, and they have a key role to play in the future of our sustainable, resilient, and nutritious food systems. This research answers 2 questions. First, how do we enable more equity in the commodity chain of underutilized species? And second, whose voices are missing from conversations about global food production? To answer these questions, we created a critical review of quinoa by analyzing research articles and reviews and interviewing quinoa experts. Over the course of 2 years, more than 90 publications and documents have been analyzed to accurately depict the quinoa boom and bust narrative. We approached this analysis of the quinoa boom and bust through food sovereignty and agroecological frameworks, and considered the social disparities embedded in intersecting systems of colonialism, capitalism, and dominant agricultural and food paradigms. Our end goal, shown here in green, is to create enabling environments for rural communities to lead and design processes for sustainable food systems. We use this case study of the quinoa boom and bust cycle to propose a contextually driven starting framework. The goal of this framework is to ensure the stewards of quinoa and other underutilized species benefit fully from a rise in demand and are not hurt by market fluctuations. To start, understanding the history of quinoa helps explain why a rapid boom in demand began about 15 years ago. For thousands of years, indigenous communities, including Inca civilizations, have lived and produced quinoa in the Andean region. Historic community institutions were structured around quinoa production. For example, it was a sacred crop used in religious festivals, ancient peoples worshipped it, and quinoa seeds were entombed as the progenitors of the city. In many ways, quinoa is a symbol of strength and power for these communities. In the 16th century, however, it soon became the target of colonists. When these Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Andean region, they took control of indigenous land and stigmatized quinoa as food for the poor. This set the stage for hundreds of years of unequal land distribution, unequal access to transportation and markets, and changes in crop production. Conquistadors also created repressive land ownership systems called haciendas, forcing indigenous people to work the land of colonists for little to no income. Throughout the last century, land redistribution policies in northern Peru and Bolivia have tried to give land back to indigenous producers, but these policies have been unorganized and inequitable. In addition, until recent years, many wealthier Peruvians and Bolivians avoided quinoa since it was still seen as a poor person's food. In fact, modern promotion of the nutritional value of quinoa still harkens back to the ancient Incas, who are revered, rather than the existing indigenous cultures that have stewarded the crop more recently. In the last 3 decades, quinoa has increased rapidly in popularity, mostly in Western societies. This was caused by increased scientific attention on quinoa's nutritional value and a shift in Western diet culture. Specifically, American culture began to value specialty produce and healthier foods in grocery stores. Diets including vegetarianism and veganism increased in popularity, and more consumers began valuing organic and fair trade foods. In addition, gluten-free diets expanded with increased public knowledge about celiac disease. Quinoa fit into all these niche lifestyles, had a pleasant taste, was extremely nutritious, eventually it's labeled as a superfood, looked similar to common grains like rice, and was easy to prepare. Despite this transformation, historical inequities continue to leave indigenous quinoa producers unsupported. This is proven in the consequences of the unmanaged quinoa boom, a period from about 2004 to 2014. During this time, producer prices increased by a factor of 7 or greater, and the quantity produced, on average, tripled. While this change was financially beneficial for many producers, it also caused multiple agronomic and cultural injustices. Specifically, indigenous producers faced cultural tensions with opportunistic growers. These growers moved to the Andean region and began producing quinoa because of increased demand and price. Oftentimes, opportunistic growers were able to produce more quinoa, manage more land, and make more money. At the same time, however, their management practices disrupted indigenous producers' familiar and communal ways of life, and their production was less sustainable from the practices of indigenous producers. For example, many indigenous communities practice communal land ownership systems, but opportunistic growers wanted to privately own land. In addition, cultural management practices were reduced or ignored, especially by opportunistic growers, as production increased to match global demand. These practices include crop rotations, long fallow or resting periods, and llama herding, and they are all important strategies to prevent soil degradation in the harsh climate of the Andes. Finally, other opportunistic growers started producing quinoa in the coastal regions of Peru. These producers often benefited from more fertile soils and less extreme weather conditions. Many coastal producers used more chemical inputs, irrigation, and mechanization to increase yields. In contrast, many highland producers practiced long crop rotations, relied on rainfall, and used little to no mechanization. Thus, coastal production outproduced highland growers, who were mostly indigenous, and saturated the quinoa market. After 2014, supply outweighed demand, and quinoa prices dropped rapidly to pre-boom levels, exacerbating historical inequities. This boom and bust occurred because there was a rushed, unregulated attempt to create a strong global commodity. A few factors influenced this conclusion. First, the governments of Peru and Bolivia were not able to support quinoa producers through institutional measures such as regulated commodity standards. Interestingly, other crops are much more supported by government policy, such as investments in production infrastructure for camu, another niche crop. Second, traditional quinoa producers were not prepared to design and manage sustainable agricultural systems which would produce uniform, market-class quality quinoa. This is because the global market for quinoa values consistency and standardization, two components which are difficult to achieve in a region that thrives on diverse quinoa varieties, mostly unmechanized production, and relatively small fields. Finally, indigenous producers were not protected from new growers who were often able to outproduce them. So, how can these consequences be prevented? We suggest 3 institutional structures to support producers and responsible land management practices. They are farmers' organizations and cooperatives. equitable and sustainable quinoa companies, and improved agricultural extension offices. Specifically, quinoa companies have the potential to solve some of the short and long-term consequences of underutilized species globalization. For example, brands like Alter Eco and Kirkland Signature work directly with traditional smallholder producers to improve sustainable farming practices, provide stable income to households, and support quinoa communities outside of the commodity chain. Most importantly, these brands communicate their mission, action, and impact clearly to consumers. This helps create a society that values equity over profit. Future work on underutilized species involves implementing some of these structures. For example, we are working with Terra Ingredients in Senegal to equitably grow the market for a West African grain, fonio. Some caveats to this work are that it is based on literature and interviews with experts and may have missed other perspectives. In addition, as of yet, there is little published on the subsequent bust cycle. In conclusion, to create equitable, inclusive commodity chains, the context and values of the culture involved should be foremost in conversations about global food production. Thank you.